Welcome to the National Security Live Action Roleplay, NSLARP Scenario Module, the decimation of the General Officer Corps. Throughout history, armies have been broken not just on the battlefield, but from within, by the degradation of leadership, the erosion of discipline, and the disruption of command structures. The Roman practice of decimation was designed to instill fear and restore discipline by executing 10% of a failed legion. But its true impact was deeper. It shattered cohesion, weakened morale, and left survivors questioning whether they were fighting for victory or merely to avoid the next purge. Today, a different kind of decimation is unfolding. The removal of 10% of the U.S. military's general officers across all branches represents an unprecedented shift in the structure of military leadership. Unlike historical reductions aimed at streamlining efficiency, this purge introduces structural instability, disrupts continuity of command, and triggers cascading failures across the military's operational, logistical, and political frameworks. Unlike historical force reductions driven by budget constraints or post-war downsizing, this purge is happening amid a broader shift in military priorities. Recent directives from the Department of Defense have dismissed key leaders, eliminated diversity and climate initiatives, and redefined the scope of military readiness. At a time of rising global instability, the deliberate thinning of top leadership disrupts continuity of command, fractures critical decision-making networks, and risks creating power vacuums both within the ranks and in the broader national security apparatus. This scenario does not assume intent, it presents consequences. Whether this decimation is part of a broader strategic realignment, a political maneuver, or an administrative purge, its impact extends beyond mere numbers. It fractures the interdependent triads that sustain military effectiveness, creating ripple effects that compromise command integrity, strategic agility, and national security. By examining the effects of this decimation through triadic analysis, teams will assess how the elimination of key leadership nodes distorts or disrupts existing patterns of interaction across the military and political landscape. This is a test of systemic resilience. How does the sudden removal of leadership impact operational readiness? What happens when institutional memory is lost overnight? How does an organization built on hierarchical stability respond to abrupt fragmentation? And who benefits from the instability left in its wake? To objectively assess the impact of decimating the General Officer Corps, we first examine how military effectiveness emerges from the harmonic balance between command, leadership, and strategy. These three elements function interdependently, each influencing and sustaining the others. Disruption in one inevitably creates instability in the others, potentially leading to systemic failures across the military's operational and strategic domains. Consider how the removal of general officers directly weakens command structures, erodes leadership credibility, and destabilizes strategic planning. Key metrics include decision latency, leadership retention rates, and consistency of strategic initiatives. Assessing these objectively will provide clarity on how the decimation impacts force cohesion and operational effectiveness. Command is the structured authority that ensures orders are given and executed efficiently, maintaining discipline and operational effectiveness. It relies on leadership to inspire confidence in directives and on strategy to ensure that commands align with broader military objectives. When 10% of general officers are removed, command authority becomes unevenly distributed, creating gaps where mid-level officers must assume responsibilities they may not be prepared for. This leads to decision-making bottlenecks, breakdowns in chain-of-command continuity, and increased operational delays. Metrics such as decision latency, command span efficiency, and deviation from operational directives will reveal the extent of fragmentation caused by this loss. Leadership provides the human element of command, ensuring that authority is not just exercised but also accepted and respected by those who must follow orders. Leadership acts as the bridge between command and strategy. Without strong leadership, command becomes ineffective, and strategy becomes disconnected from real-world execution. A sudden reduction in general officers risks eroding trust and morale among mid-level officers and enlisted personnel, leading to hesitation, insubordination, and reduced force cohesion. Metrics such as troop confidence levels, retention rates, and speed of crisis response would indicate how well leadership is holding up under these conditions. Strategy is the overarching framework that aligns military actions with national objectives, ensuring that both command structures and leadership decisions serve a coherent, long-term purpose. The loss of 10% of general officers means fewer minds refining doctrine, conducting wargaming, and evaluating threats, leading to a degradation in strategic adaptability. If lower-level commanders are forced to engage in strategic planning, the likelihood of short-term reactive decision-making increases and synchronization across theaters of operation weakens. Metrics such as strategic initiative retention, cross-theater coordination efficiency, and frequency of unplanned tactical shifts would help gauge the extent to which military effectiveness is compromised. Next, we evaluate how general officers maintain effective operational execution through the causal triad of oversight, delegation, and execution. Senior officers ensure that tasks are clearly defined, responsibilities efficiently assigned, and performance closely monitored. Removing these key nodes interrupts the causal chain, potentially generating operational bottlenecks and systemic inefficiencies. In analyzing this triad, look closely at how diminished oversight leads to unchecked errors, how delegation becomes compromised, and how execution falters under overloaded command structures. Measure impacts through metrics such as error detection rates, delegation effectiveness, operational tempo, and task completion timelines. Using these metrics will help objectively pinpoint the systemic consequences of a disrupted causal triad. Oversight ensures that all military actions remain aligned with strategic goals, operational standards, and legal frameworks. General officers provide high-level risk assessment, strategic continuity, and accountability over ongoing operations. Cutting 10% of them increases the risk of undetected failures, misaligned priorities, and fractured command synchronization. With fewer eyes on critical functions, errors may propagate unchecked, leading to operational inefficiencies or unintended escalations in conflicts. Key metrics, such as error escalation rates, compliance deviation, and oversight to operational discrepancy, will highlight how well oversight is maintained post-decimation. Delegation is the mechanism by which authority and responsibility are distributed efficiently across military structures. General officers manage this process by ensuring that tasks are assigned appropriately, balancing workload among subordinate officers while preventing leadership fatigue. With fewer generals, delegation becomes strained, forcing mid-level officers to absorb additional burdens, increasing stress and slowing responsiveness. This imbalance creates a backlog of decisions awaiting approval, delays in resource allocation, and reduced adaptability in crisis scenarios. Metrics such as task overload index, operational tempo maintenance, and backlog severity in command pipelines would provide insight into the impact of weakened delegation. Execution is where strategy, command, and oversight translate into concrete military actions. Execution depends on clear directives, timely resource allocation, and uninterrupted operational momentum. With decimation-induced disruptions in oversight and delegation, execution becomes vulnerable to increased delays, miscommunication, and operational paralysis. Forces in the field may find themselves waiting on decisions from overburdened commanders, leading to missed windows of opportunity, stalled operations, and reduced combat effectiveness. Metrics such as decision execution time lag, deviation from intended operational timelines, and mission completion rate variability would indicate the extent of execution failures. The military's ability to effectively respond to evolving threats and maintain operational readiness relies on the nonlinear balance among doctrine, adaptation, and logistics. General officers play critical roles in balancing these elements, ensuring that established doctrines inform adaptive responses, which in turn shape logistical planning and execution. The removal of senior leadership disturbs this nonlinear balance, potentially making the military either too rigid or overly chaotic. To clearly assess this area, evaluate how reduced doctrinal oversight affects military flexibility, how disrupted adaptation processes hinder responsiveness, and how logistics suffer from inadequate strategic guidance. Key metrics include doctrine review frequency, adaptive response efficiency, logistical readiness rates, and supply chain disruptions. Objective analysis of these indicators will help identify areas of greatest vulnerability. Doctrine provides the guiding principles that govern military operations, ensuring consistency in decision-making across all levels of command. It serves as a stabilizing force, allowing adaptation without unnecessary risk. General officers play a key role in refining, updating, and implementing doctrine in response to evolving threats. A 10% reduction in their ranks means fewer experienced leaders shaping policy, leading to doctrinal stagnation and vulnerability to emerging forms of warfare. If mid-level officers attempt to compensate, policy changes may become erratic, with an increased risk of fragmentation between different branches or operational theaters. Metrics such as doctrinal update frequency, doctrinal compliance rate, and inter-branch doctrinal synchronization would highlight how well doctrine adapts post-decimation. Adaptation is the military's ability to adjust to changing threats, technologies, and battlefield conditions. It requires both structured foresight and real-time flexibility, both of which are heavily influenced by senior leadership. Fewer general officers means fewer decision-makers guiding adaptive strategies, leading to either overcorrection, excessive reactionary changes, or rigidity, fear of making adjustments without senior approval. The result is a force that may either fail to react in time or react in a way that is inconsistent with broader military objectives. Metrics such as adaptive response success rate, deviation from planned strategic posture, and decision variability under stress would help assess adaptation effectiveness. Logistics is the backbone of operational readiness, ensuring that personnel, equipment, and supplies are where they need to be when they need to be there. General officers coordinate large-scale resource distribution, preventing supply chain inefficiencies and ensuring sustainment under combat conditions. The loss of 10% of these senior leaders increases the likelihood of misallocation, delayed shipments, and failure to prioritize critical supply lines. If supply chains become disrupted, operational forces may find themselves undermanned, under-equipped, or stalled altogether. Metrics such as supply chain fulfillment rate, logistics delay frequency, and resource misallocation occurrences would indicate the level of logistical disruption. Finally, we assess the broader societal implications through the conjoined triad of political, military, and civil domains. General officers function as essential bridges, coordinating military actions with civilian leadership and maintaining public trust. The sudden decimation of senior military ranks threatens to disrupt these critical relationships, posing risks not just to military stability, but also national security and societal cohesion. Examine how reductions in senior leadership influence civilian-military trust, domestic stability, and perceptions of national security among international actors. Relevant metrics include civil-military trust indices, recruitment and retention trends, frequency of civil unrest, and shifts in adversarial behavior. These objective measures clarify how the internal disruption of military structures might ripple outward, affecting national and global stability. Political stability relies on a strong and predictable military structure. General officers serve as critical liaisons between civilian leadership and the armed forces, ensuring that military operations align with national policy. A sudden 10% cut raises the risk of civil-military distrust, particularly if the reductions are seen as politically motivated or as an attempt to consolidate executive control over the military. This perception could lead to heightened tensions between defense leadership and civilian authorities, resulting in policy paralysis or erratic shifts in military engagement strategies. Metrics such as Civil-Military Trust Index, strategic policy alignment, and frequency of senior-level disputes would highlight the extent of political instability. Military readiness depends not only on numbers but also on institutional continuity and force cohesion. The decimation of general officers disrupts established command relationships, weakens unit cohesion, and increases stress on remaining leaders. If general officers are removed based on non-meritocratic criteria, like political purges, the perception of instability within the ranks may grow, leading to recruitment shortfalls, defections, or resistance within the chain of command. Metrics such as Force Cohesion Index, leadership stability rates, and retention trends among senior officers would reveal how effectively the military is adapting to these changes. Civil society's relationship with the military is shaped by public trust, national security confidence, and perceived institutional integrity. A highly visible purge of senior officers can erode public faith in military stability, leading to reduced recruitment, increased skepticism toward military actions, and even civil unrest if the public perceives the cuts as reckless or dangerous. If adversaries perceive this instability, they may increase aggression, exploit weakened deterrence, or initiate gray zone conflicts. Metrics such as public confidence in national defense, recruitment rate fluctuations, and adversarial escalation incidents would indicate how these changes influence national security. This scenario presents a moment of profound structural instability, where teams must assess the systemic consequences of decimating the General Officer Corps and determine how institutional resilience, or failure, unfolds in its wake. The process of response, interpret, plan, execute, relies on recognizing the triadic relationships that sustain military effectiveness and national security, and how their disruption reshapes strategic, operational, and political landscapes. At each stage, these relationships define where vulnerabilities emerge, how forces interact, and what structural dynamics influence the trajectory of institutional collapse or adaptation. Interpretation stage, identifying patterns of structural disruption. Understanding the impact of military leadership decimation requires mapping the interdependent systems that sustain command authority, strategic continuity, and operational effectiveness. The removal of 10% of general officers is not merely a loss of personnel, it is a reconfiguration of decision-making structures, power flows, and institutional balance. In this environment, stability is dictated not by the number of officers lost, but by how well the remaining structure absorbs the shock. Command, leadership, and strategy. Military effectiveness relies on a harmonic equilibrium between command authority, leadership trust, and strategic coherence. When one weakens, the others follow. The sudden removal of senior officers fractures this balance, creating uncertainty in directives, eroding morale, and distorting long-term strategic objectives. As gaps form, decisions slow, competing visions emerge, and fragmented command structures struggle to maintain unity of purpose. Oversight, delegation, and execution. Effective military function depends on clear oversight mechanisms, efficient delegation of responsibility, and disciplined execution of orders. With fewer general officers, oversight diminishes, delegation becomes strained, and execution bottlenecks emerge. When tasks exceed capacity, errors multiply, unchecked assumptions go unchallenged, and operational paralysis sets in. Without intervention, the system risks slipping into a cycle where decisions are either stalled or made reactively, with unforeseen consequences. Doctrine, adaptation, and logistics. Military stability requires a nonlinear balance between established doctrine, adaptive capability, and logistical sustainment. Decimation weakens doctrinal oversight, disrupting the mechanisms that ensure strategy remains flexible but coherent. If adaptation is left unchecked, forces may act without alignment to broader objectives. If doctrine remains rigid, outdated policies dictate action even when conditions demand change. Logistics, dependent on precise planning and strategic foresight, becomes erratic, as supply chains suffer from misallocation, delays, and unforeseen gaps in sustainment. Political, military, and civil. The military does not operate in isolation. Its stability influences and is influenced by the political system and civilian society. The removal of senior officers destabilizes civil-military relations, raising questions about institutional legitimacy, political motivations, and national security readiness. As uncertainty spreads, public trust in military leadership erodes, civilian leadership struggles to manage perception, and adversaries recalibrate their strategic postures in response to perceived internal weakness. Planning stage. Evaluating risks and strategic trajectories. Once teams understand the systemic distortions caused by decimation, they must assess how different forces interact to reinforce, resist, or exploit the new reality. In this stage, teams must determine whether fragmentation can be managed, whether institutional inertia can be redirected, and where the most significant points of leverage exist in reshaping the post-decimation security landscape. Fragmentation, overcompensation, and realignment. Institutions under sudden stress do not fail in a single way. Fragmentation leads to competing centers of authority as mid-level officers struggle to fill leadership gaps. Overcompensation can drive excessive consolidation of power, where remaining officers assume greater control, but at the cost of overburdened decision-making structures. Realignment offers the possibility of restructured command hierarchies. but whether these will stabilize or further degrade institutional integrity remains uncertain. Bottlenecks, workarounds, and breakdowns. The loss of general officers slows decision-making, overloading remaining structures. Bottlenecks emerge where too many decisions funnel through too few leaders. Workarounds, informal chains of command, delegated authorities, external interventions, may provide temporary relief, but also introduce unpredictability. Breakdown occurs when gaps in oversight or execution create cascading failures, where small disruptions amplify into systemic dysfunction. Institutional rigidity, reactive instability, and strategic drift. Without deliberate intervention, institutions tend to react in one of three ways. They become rigid, clinging to established processes, even when those processes no longer work. They become reactive, making erratic adjustments without coherence. Or they drift, allowing events to dictate response rather than maintaining strategic direction. Each carries risks, and each presents opportunities for external forces, whether public actors, policymakers, or adversarial nations, to shape the outcome. Execution stage, navigating a fractured command environment. The final stage is engagement, determining how teams operate within a system where command is compromised, oversight is weakened, and institutional resilience is uncertain. In this stage, teams must determine how fractured authority structures function, where influence truly resides, and how narratives shape institutional adaptation or collapse. Authority, legitimacy, and compliance. In a destabilized military structure, authority does not necessarily equate to legitimacy, and legitimacy does not guarantee compliance. Those who issue orders may not have the confidence of those receiving them. Those who command trust may not have formal authority. Those who refuse to comply may do so out of institutional loyalty rather than defiance. Understanding these fractures is essential for navigating a landscape where official structures may not align with functional power dynamics. Communication networks, decision nodes, and institutional influence. Control over information flow dictates control over action. With leadership ranks thinned, informal decision nodes, advisors' networks of officers, external consultants, may gain influence. The question is not just who holds command, but who shapes perception, consolidates narratives, and drives institutional direction. Identifying key networks and understanding how decisions propagate will determine who ultimately steers the military's trajectory post-decimation. Perception management, strategic uncertainty, and national stability. Military readiness is not measured only in force capability, but in perception, both internal and external. If confidence in institutional resilience is lost, adversaries may escalate, allies may reconsider commitments, and domestic political pressure may reshape decision-making. Those who best control the perception of stability, whether within the ranks or in the public sphere, will define the post-decimation reality. Finally, let's explore strategic triads to guide LARP operations teams. Each operational team faces distinct challenges in navigating the decimation of the General Officer Corps. While the effects of this structural upheaval ripple across all domains, the triadic models within each team provide a framework for assessing vulnerabilities, developing strategies, and executing actions effectively. Below, we outline key strategic triads for each team, emphasizing how they might structure their approach to the broader crisis. The Intelligence Operations Team, framing intelligence in a fragmented landscape. With military leadership thinned, intelligence collection is no longer just about tracking external threats. It must also compensate for weakened internal command structures. The Intelligence Operations Team must account for gaps in oversight, shifts in institutional power, and the increased likelihood of fragmented or contradictory directives. Surveillance focuses on identifying emerging power vacuums, tracking new decision-making nodes, and monitoring adversarial exploitation of instability. Synthesis becomes critical, as intelligence must now compensate for missing institutional memory, ensuring that analysis accounts for both official and unofficial power dynamics. Strategic action involves shaping decision-making by directing intelligence flows where they are most effective, whether by stabilizing weakened command structures influencing public narratives or countering adversarial misinformation. In this new environment, intelligence is not just about knowing, it is about structuring perception in a world where command certainty has eroded. The Cybersecurity Team, exploiting digital instability. The sudden removal of high-ranking officers creates opportunities and vulnerabilities in the digital battle space. Chain-of-command disruptions mean communication structures are strained, and adversaries will seek to exploit confusion. The cybersecurity team must not only secure critical infrastructure but also capitalize on digital chaos to gain asymmetric advantages. Defense ensures that communication lines, data integrity, and operational networks remain secure amid leadership uncertainty. Deception takes advantage of adversaries' assumptions about weakened command structures, manipulating false signals, masking real vulnerabilities, and leading external threats into digital traps. Disruption shifts the balance of power by actively undermining enemy cyber operations, inserting strategic misinformation, or delaying adversarial decision-making through cyber interference. In a destabilized command environment, controlling the digital terrain is as vital as controlling physical battlefields. The counterintelligence team, navigating internal fractures. Internal security is at its most vulnerable when institutional structures are in flux. The counterintelligence team must recognize that foreign and domestic actors will seek to exploit leadership gaps either by infiltrating weakened command structures or by fostering internal division. Detection involves identifying emerging insider threats, compromised personnel, and shifts in loyalties as officers realign their careers and allegiances in response to structural instability. Deflection manipulates adversarial efforts, turning attempted infiltration into misdirection opportunities, feeding false information to external actors, or using controlled leaks to influence perceptions. Neutralization ensures that threats, whether individuals, networks, or broader psychological warfare efforts, are decisively managed before they escalate into systemic vulnerabilities. A compromised military does not collapse from force alone, it collapses from within. Counterintelligence must work to prevent this before the fractures become irreparable. The diplomatic team, redefining power in a shifting order. The decimation of military leadership alters diplomatic power balances both domestically and internationally. Alliances may be tested, adversaries may probe for weakness, and internal political factions may attempt to fill the power vacuum. The diplomatic team must recognize that their role is not merely to negotiate, but to actively shape the perception of stability. Leverage identifies where power still resides, whether in surviving leadership institutional memory or civilian partnerships, and ensures that weakened structures are not exposed to further exploitation. Legitimacy works to maintain confidence in military readiness, ensuring that allied nations, political entities, and the general public do not lose trust in national defense capabilities. Narrative control actively counters destabilizing rhetoric, crafting messages that reinforce continuity and strategic focus while preventing adversaries from dictating the terms of discourse. In times of institutional upheaval, perception defines reality. Diplomacy is not just about maintaining alliances, it is about ensuring that others believe those alliances remain unshaken. The tactical response team, operating without a safety net. The loss of senior leadership removes a layer of strategic oversight, meaning crisis response must now be more autonomous, adaptive, and resource-conscious. The tactical response team must structure itself for high-speed, high-risk operations in an environment where institutional support is inconsistent. Rapid assessment ensures that crisis situations are understood in real time, prioritizing immediate threats and determining what resources are still operational. Resource coordination compensates for logistical shortfalls, working to secure equipment, personnel, and transportation when traditional command pathways are unreliable. Decisive action takes advantage of speed and initiative, operating in an environment where slow-moving bureaucratic processes can no longer be relied upon. When command fractures, action shifts to those who can move fastest. Tactical response teams must be ready to take initiative when others hesitate. The decimation of the General Officer Corps scenario does not present a single failure point, it presents a systemic unraveling that affects every layer of national security. This scenario does not unfold as a singular crisis, but as a cascading failure. The loss of 10% of general officers is not a mere numerical reduction, it is a structural shockwave that disrupts command authority, strategic direction, and institutional cohesion. What follows is not just uncertainty, but a reconfiguration of military, political, and global power dynamics. The outcome is dictated not just by what is lost, but by how remaining structures compensate, or fail to do so. Military institutions are designed for resilience, but that resilience assumes continuity, not abrupt decimation. Without deliberate and coordinated responses, three failure modes dominate. Fragmentation. Competing centers of authority emerge, leading to internal factionalization and disorder. Overcompensation. Remaining leadership consolidates power, but in doing so it creates bottlenecks that further slow decision-making and execution. Strategic drift. Without strong oversight, the institution loses direction, reacting to crises rather than shaping outcomes. Each response carries risks. The question is not whether the system will adapt, but whether that adaptation preserves strategic coherence or accelerates collapse. In the absence of stable command, power does not disappear, it shifts. The critical uncertainty in this scenario is who will claim authority and how they will wield it. Will mid-level officers create informal command networks to compensate for lost leadership? Will external political actors seek to reshape military priorities in their own image? Will adversaries exploit the vacuum to alter global power dynamics? The future is determined by those who understand how influence operates in an unstable environment. Stability is not restored by default. It must be constructed, asserted, and defended. This scenario is not a theoretical exercise in crisis response, it is a study in how systems fail, adapt, or are reshaped. The teams engaged in this scenario are not merely responding to disruption, they are defining what comes next. In the absence of clear command, the new order will be established by those who best understand its